Hey everybody, welcome back to the Never Stop Building YouTube channel. This is Jason, and today we got one more lecture from the 2023 Maine Japanese Woodworking Festival. This time I am bringing you my friend Brian Holcombe. So Brian and I became fast friends early on at the New York CAS events. He has a background in race car building and machining and technical prowess that is very inspiring. I'm constantly amazed by the detail that he puts into his setups, into his tool organization, his shop. He's just really squared away, and it's always great to bounce ideas off of him and learn from his process. He's largely self-taught. He's based out of Princeton, New Jersey, where he makes furniture, chairs, doors, architectural Japanese woodwork, tea rooms, and that type of stuff. So in this lecture, he's going to be going through his process of making shoji doors using a modern shop approach, a lot of machine setups, and it's really fascinating to see how you can actually make money in doing Japanese woodwork, and a lot of that requires a very efficient process, and Brian has it dialed in. So I hope you enjoy this lecture. Any questions you have, please put them in the comments section, and here we go.
When I started making these, I started making them with 100% hand tools. So just hand planes. I didn't use a planer or nothing like that, just hand planes. Saws, chisels. And I've slowly evolved to the point where, for the most part, I make these now, I'd say, without hardly any hand tools. And the reason is that when I make these, I'm usually making them more than one. Like for example, a job recently had 40 of these to make. So when you're up against that, you start thinking really quickly, how exactly should I be doing this in a way which produces something high quality, but does it way more effectively than doing it by hand. As when these were made entirely by hand in Japan, they had more than one person doing it. And so that helps. So one of the first steps I took was to start looking at mortising machines. And actually, while we're on the topic of just general stuff, if you guys have a question throughout, just raise your hand or just shout it out. I'm fine with that. I don't really want to speak continuously without interruption, so if you got something that comes up, go ahead. So the place that my journey took me as I started getting into machinery was first the basic stuff, your joiner, planer, that kind of thing. So once I had that down, I moved on to specialized machinery, which is utilized mainly in window making. So the first place I landed was this particular machine. This is a Maka SM6, and it's the pneumatic version. So for those of you not familiar, which is probably everybody in this audience, this is it's called an oscillating chisel mortiser. So if you're familiar with a chisel mortiser like those that were shown earlier, this is a lot different than that. This takes a chisel and it wiggles it back and forth and oscillates like this as it plunges, and it produces a mortise that is pretty much perfect. So this is probably worth zooming in on. Yeah. So this produces a mortise that is, if you touch it with a chisel, you're making it worse.
We're not going to be able to put that up on the screen.
No, just take a look. I'll hand this around to you also.
And you use it for mortises on the ends as well?
Yeah, I use that only for the mortises on the ends because this machine will only make a rectangle. It won't make a square.
Okay.
All right, so, and that's somewhat important for this because we're going to make a lot of small square holes, but not quite yet. So this machine, when I found it, was basically a heap that was utilized in a window shop. They had more or less destroyed it and tipped it over. And so I bought it for $400. And so I went ahead and restored it, which was quite a process. So like Jason was saying, I had worked in a machine shop when I was a kid. And so I utilized a lot of those skills to repair this machine, which when I was looking for this particular machine, there were none out there. Every once in a while they pop up and somebody will buy it. But at the time I'm looking, of course, whenever you're looking for something, there are none available. And so I went ahead and bought this one and restored it. I had to resurface the table. Somebody had thrown away the fence, so I had to remake the fence. I just bought a big slab of cast iron and made one. Added dust collection. I recut the ways, straightened out the head, rebuilt the machine, which this is originally made in Germany. And German machinery has a lot of bearings in it. All right, so I replaced something like 35 bearings, all for a fairly simple machine. Somebody cut out all the wiring, so I had to redo all the wiring. So I taught myself how to set up basic machine controls, basic motor controls, which for this one it's operated on a pneumatic switch. So there's a foot pedal, you step on the foot pedal, it plunges the head and starts the operation of the cutter automatically. And then at the end of the travel, it stops cutting and goes back into its original position. This is air over oil. So there's tubes that are filled with oil in the top half of this machine, and they set the depth, how quickly it plunges into the wood with that particular arrangement. And there's pneumatic clamps that clamp the part automatically as soon as you hit the foot pedal. So it's an awesome machine. It cuts that mortise that's going around in about maybe 5 or 10 seconds. And so it's quite the process. So that was one of the ways I started to speed up this process of cutting, of making shoji. Part of it was the cutout. So next up, I moved on to getting another type of mortiser, which when you do this kind of work, you find that you need a lot of mortisers. And this is a chisel mortiser. So I had a couple requirements. One of them was that it had to be old iron. Old iron stuff is a lot heavier than the new things. And so this machine is it's a little tiny thing. It's not very big. And it's probably 900 pounds of cast iron. So yeah, European machines, for the most part, this came from England. They use a lot of cast iron. So they seem to have it in abundance. The U.S. used to do the same thing up until fairly recently, when they realized it's really expensive to put a lot of cast iron into machinery. So luckily this one's from the 60s, where that was not a concern. This also required a bit of work. So I made I straightened out the fence. So the manufacturer for this is Woodworking, and my experience with Woodworking has been that they get you most of the way there, but it's still considered a woodworking machine where nobody cares about tolerances. And so I had to straighten out the fence and recut the table myself to get it accurate. Then I made that pallet system for it. So this area also made the stops. The stops are they operate with they're on a linear rail, and they have a pneumatic clamp. So you just pull them over to where you want them and then release the clamp. And this is all sort of critical to making this sort of thing fast and effectively, because what I'm after is to have accuracy from the beginning. So accuracy and precision. And I utilize those stops along with the setup blocks, the 1, 2, 3 blocks, which, if you're not familiar, grab yourself a set of those. They're not very expensive, and they're super useful. And I can make a position between stops very accurately. So if I lay out my shoji, if I lay out my kumiko, which is going to be this part, on my machine, I can go between positions very quickly, because I can say, all right, I'm going to set these so that one block is the distance between these parts. And then when I take that block to the next machine, I have that exact same position, so I don't have to mark out all these. So when I'm cutting kumiko for 40 shoji screens and it's all tightly knit, I know that with confidence I can go from one machine to the next and cut it quickly. And it's, when you add up these kind of things, it takes days and days of work and turns it into hours. And you're going to see later on in this slideshow where we're at with that. So this is the part where I'm cutting for a small mortise that is part of the the kumiko assembly. So the kumiko, once it's assembled, it has a lot of small tenons all around it, and they go into this frame. And that's one of the ways it's to do that. There's another called a sukeko, where it's basically a small frame that goes within the larger frame. I used to cut them like that. I like this a little bit better. It's a little cleaner in my opinion. So moving on. So those are the small mortises, and like we were talking about earlier, I think it was Jeff that was talking about this. Cutting a square mortise by hand is incredibly time consuming. And so when you move on to doing it with a chisel mortiser, it's a lot more time effective. However, if they're not set up properly, you get an odd defect, which I'm going to show you. So when I cut this square mortise, one of the things I had to deal with was the fact that if you cut a square like this with a chisel mortiser, a lot of times the bit moves and it cuts this little half moon shape out of the side of it. So I modified the auger, which is the part that goes inside of the chisel setup. I modified that to be smaller than the diameter, than the square radius or square of the cutter, enough so that no matter what, if that moved around a little bit, it wouldn't put a little half moon on the outside. Because if you have that half moon, what's going to happen is it's going to show right here, and nobody will ever notice except for me, but it's going to be one of those things that from the onset, when I added machinery to my process, the requirement for me was that it's either got to improve my process while maintaining quality, or improve my process while improving quality. So that was an important step for me. And so you have to overcome all these small things that come up when you're using machinery.
How did you shrunk that bit down?
Yep.
How did you do that?
I ground the radius.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like around it, and then
Yeah.
oh, okay. And am I right that just the tip is the sharpest?
Yep. So for the most part,
Really?
the auger flutes are generally smaller than the cutter at the bottom. So you can just shrink that a little bit, and it doesn't take a lot.
Yeah.
And you can be right on. And the other part of it is that the augers, as they arrive from the factory, are, in my opinion, not very sharp.
Yeah.
So you have to sharpen them to be extremely sharp, and then they stay centered. If they're not that sharp, they tend to want to walk.
Yeah.
All right, so the next process is cutting tenons, and that I do with a table saw. And now Shoji, the way that the tenons are formed on Shoji is it's fairly unique to Shoji. It has what's called the Jaguchi joint, so that has this little 45-degree angle on the tenon shoulder. And that adds quite a bit of complication to this. The reason why they have that, of course, is so that you can have this nice facade without a step between these two parts. And it's done in the way where we're going to compare it to another approach. So the other approach to doing this is going to be to cut a notch in your style. All right, so now your rail comes over and it looks like that. Now the reason why I don't cut it like that is that when the wood shrinks, which inevitably it will, that's going to show a gap at this top corner. There's going to gap right here. Now, this style of cutting that, where you have the Jaguchi sticking out like this, is helpful because if this part shrinks, if the style shrinks and it produces a gap between those two parts, it goes pretty much unnoticed, because when you look at it from the face, you don't see that. So if you look at these, like if you sight down the side of them, they're all tight, but if they were open for some reason, it's pretty much imperceivable. However, that makes the cutout part of this a little bit more complicated, and so the cutout of the tenons is a couple more steps than it would be otherwise. So if you were going to speed up this process and it was just a simple tenon, what you do is set up cutters on a shaper and cut it that way. Now you can go ahead and buy yourself some fancy cutters for your shaper, and that will accomplish the task. But if you're doing it and you want to remain thrifty, then you have to get a little more creative. So this is another part of shoji making I'll go over fairly quickly. So when I make these, 8 or 10 foot tall, which is something that's fairly common in American architecture, which is going to be almost, I don't imagine there's any shoji screens in Japan that are very often made 10 foot tall, but it's something that's asked of me all the time. So you have to build panels into it. So the normal shoji screen is going to be just like that, or these, it's going to have a panel, a kick panel. So this section of it is consumed by just a wooden panel. So I fit that into the process very early on, and I plan it around I plan the thickness of the panel around the same as the mortises, so that the groove I cut between those two parts is the same. For me, it's a 1/2 inch, so my tenons are a 1/2 inch to make the whole thing the same, so that one can transition into the other without having to have any kind of concerns about that. Makes the panel a little thicker, which is, in my opinion, just fine. Because a lot of times if I'm making a panel system and it's fairly tall, I want to have room in those panels to tongue and groove so that they attach to one another fairly easily.
Solid wood, not veneer and MDF.
Yes, for shoji making, for the most part, it's all solid wood. I don't think I've ever had to manufacture styles that were fabricated of something.
At the center panels.
Yeah, no MDF. Yeah, for the most part, because these go in all kinds of different settings, and veneer over MDF for me adds just enough additional complication that I'd rather just use solid wood. For the most part, the clientele want solid wood also, so they're okay with if you have some deviation between boards. Question?
Most of the clientele would know that, oh, no, you're being recorded, don't answer that.
No, that's fine. So one of the important things for me is that I like to educate the clients so that they know what they're buying. So if somebody comes to me and they say, well, what's the difference between this and something else? I'm going to spend a lot of time explaining that to them. These are the steps I take. This is the quality of the work that you get, and compare and contrast to something else, so that they know, okay, I'm paying, for this amount of this quality of material, and I can, and I'm paying for this quality of work, so that they know when they receive it at the end that they got what they paid for. Which for me, I definitely have a drive to produce something high quality, and I hope for the most part that I get there. And so I suppose it tends to filter out people who just want aesthetic and don't care that much about quality. So if they just want aesthetic, they'll move on to somebody else who's just putting together aesthetic, which there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't do it. So we can see here a couple more things as we go on. So one thing you'll notice is that there's a simple but obvious shape to these parts. So the next step along the process is to produce this rabbet, and then the chamfers that go all the way around. And this is where my work product, for the most part, deviates a little bit from traditional, because from traditional, I don't believe that they do this, where they have a dedicated area for the paper. So I tend to do that. It's something that in the US, for the most part, the fact that the paper is simply glued onto the back of it is something that does give people a lot of pause. They tend to think that it's going to be completely finished on all faces. And so that's about a halfway point between traditional Japanese and something that is, sold in America. So for the most part, I'd say American clients expect that there's going to be kumiko sandwiching a piece of paper. However, it's very difficult to produce that in a way which it's repairable, and I want these to be repairable. So I tend to stick to traditional and deviate very, very, very little where possible. So I run those on a router table that I fitted with a a power feeder. So you can put those on a router table, and I use that to make the chamfers all the way around. The chamfers at this stage are made so that they engage with that Jiguchi joint.
So you climb cut those with the power feeder?
Yes, always climb cut. Yeah. Which, if you're not familiar, climb cutting is going with the cutter, and I guess standard cutting is going against it. So if a cutter is
But you need the power feeder otherwise. Or it's gonna jump the sandwich.
this rotates like that. So if your direction of feed is like this, you're pushing against the cutter. That's your standard feed, right? And if you're pushing it like this, it's called climb cutting. This is climb cutting. If you're doing this without a power feeder, you're going to throw the part across the room, and it's going to make your life more exciting for a minute. Might be what you're after. I don't know.
Say you're using a manual mill and you're feeding the table, it'll catch and it can pull it, right?
Yes, exactly. So if you've ever used a handheld router and it grabs and goes over to another spot, you've experienced climb cutting. All right. So this is when you step up the next level of machinery, which this router table, this is pretty small time, but it works. But if you do that on a shaper, you're going to have a really exciting day.
So why are you climb cut?
Now the reason for climb cutting, perfect, I appreciate that. So the reason for climb cutting is that as you're climb cutting, the chip is removed without, it's removed with support behind it. So as you're cutting, the chip is removed in a way that, it's hard to explain this. So as you're going standard cut, you get to the end of the cut, right? And that chip has a little tiny support, and it breaks out, and it usually tears out a piece with it. So if you have ultra sharp cutters, maybe it won't happen, but it happens to me often enough that I don't want to cut it that way. I want to climb cut it, and generally speaking, I'll have less tear out and less chip out with climb cutting, and so I almost always climb cut if I can. It just makes life way easier as you go through the next process.
But you can only do that with a power feeder.
Well,
Safely.
yes. Yes. Since I'm being recorded here, do it with a power feeder. That's it.
What if you just climb cut the very end where it's gonna tear out and then you?
I guess you could do that. Yeah. I mean, there's times when I get creative with these sort of things just to, you never know. You run into an odd situation, you got to get creative. So, yeah, you might want to save that for a situation where you absolutely have to.
Are you setting up your machines for every job differently, or do you run like 10-foot, 12-foot stock of that and just cut it when you need it?
That's a good question. So, I didn't cover this at the beginning, but one of the things that is somewhat critical to this is that the stock has to be cut exactly so. And so, because of that, I tend to run the parts individually as opposed to running an entire length of material and then cutting it down to specific parts. It's debatable. It might be faster to do it that way. One of the things with this particular work is that I like it to be extremely flat and extremely straight, and it's hard to achieve that on 12-foot long parts and then cut them to length. But yeah, that's also a way that you could possibly do it. I believe there's people who cut kumiko all different ways, and I've seen people like just make a big board and then rip it after the fact. So we can go over all those things. So next up, this is as the tenons are turning into something with the Jiguchi joint. So on this particular one, that was for a specialty screen where they wanted to have a facade at the back of it, and so there's a Jiguchi on both sides of it, enough to take up this space. So it overlapped that. So this was an additionally complicated one. It was for a sauna. So this part of the process, I basically stand the part upright and cut it through the machine. So it doesn't bother me anymore, but if you're new to this, I wouldn't do that.
You have the router
blade,
table?
Yeah, I'm using a dado blade on that.
special ground for the gamuji cut, or just you hang
No,
it?
I just, actually what I do is tip the blade
You're saying
and just cut it with the tenon standing straight up, so, yeah, don't do that.
Like a tenon and jig? No? Just
Nope.
freehand it?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. I'm not recommending it, that's just what I do. So,
What kind of table saw do you have?
the table saw is an Almia. It's a German-made table saw. I'm pretty happy with this thing. It's a mix between light duty and heavy duty. So the table is really nice and heavy. It has those striped lines. So those are cuts from a planer, which if you haven't made yourself familiar with it, a metal planer is it's a single point cutter that goes over the top of the surface. It works very similarly to a CNC machine, but it's just scraping a cut across. It produces a pretty flat surface, so way flatter than the surfaces which are normally ground by the manufacturer. So every time I've dealt with a ground surface, it's usually not that flat. This, on the other hand, is very flat, so it's handy for that sort of thing. But otherwise, the table saw is fairly light duty. It's just a sheet metal machine. So the nice thing about that is that I can run through joinery quickly because it has, you can see the outrigger over there. I made my own stop for it because the original stop was kind of a piece of junk. So I made one that doesn't move when you set it. And you can see those 1, 2, 3 blocks, the setup blocks that I have, and I'm using that to set distances. So I can go through my distances really quickly. You can see on the other side here, this was for a job that wasn't necessarily Shoji, but it was made the same way. And those cuts, those cuts with the dado blade are there. These. So I found that the more precise I make these, the easier this entire process is, because once I go on to assembly, where whatever time you've saved yourself throughout the process of manufacturing, if you go on to assembly and you find that your parts are not assembling perfectly square, you're going to consume all that time and then some. And so when you're making a lot of something, if it doesn't assemble perfectly square, you're going to be having a bad day, especially if you're trying to make some money. The next machine I added to this process, which was life-changing, was this super surfacer. So this is an old style super surfacer. It's from the 60s. It's a brick outhouse. Every part of it is cast, which is amazing. Only thing is, it doesn't have an auto return. So it's not the modern style, which has an auto return where if you put a part through it, so if you're not familiar, when you put a part through a modern super surfacer, it goes through the super surfacer and then returns to you. This one, I stand basically in front of the machine, feed a part through like this and just catch it like that. So it ends up being pretty fast, but for long parts, it is a little bit terrifying.
What are the knives like in a super surfacer?
It's a good question. So this was originally a set of knives that had to be ground, so they look just like a plane blade. They look like a very large plane blade. They have the sub blade. The whole assembly just is essentially identical to that from a hand plane. It's just turned upside down, and it's 12 inches or 13 inches wide, as opposed to 2 inches. So I spoke to Jim Blavel, and Jim actually sent me his knife group from his machine, which has a replaceable knife, which if you don't have a grinder for these machines, the way to get around that is to have a replaceable knife. And so I took that, brought it to a machine shop. They took my knives and turned them into that. And I also, I was taking the both and course of action, which was to buy one from Kanafusa, which was going to take something like 13 weeks to ship. And so while that time was being consumed, I had somebody make one for me, because if you got work to do, I'm not waiting 13 weeks. But this machine, like all the other machines I've seemed to acquire, it was a hunk of junk when I bought it. And so I had to completely disassemble it, restore it. The guy before me had decided he was going to turn it into a single-phase machine and destroyed all the wiring in the process. And so I had to rewire it, replace the motor. So it's a bit of effort. If you really want to do all this kind of thing, Because these things don't come up very often, and I also can't afford to just simply buy one from Maranaka brand new. If you haven't priced one, do so. It's entertaining. So I went ahead. I'm trying to do it on the thrift, so this bug is going to be part of the presentation there. And so I bought it from a guy who made guitar parts, and so he didn't have a really high requirement for the process that was, the amount of wide parts that were going to go through this machine. And so he was okay with just running it in the way he had it set up, which, if you're not familiar, when you take a machine that is three-phase and turn it into a single-phase machine with what's called a static converter, it takes the horsepower of this machine and cuts it down to a portion of that. So if you're putting 2-inch wide parts through it, it doesn't really matter. But if you're putting, 10-inch wide parts through it, it does matter. And so I ended up having to replace the motor, which was ruined by this whole process, and replace the electronics. Given that I teach people in my shop, I also update the electronics to be, fairly modern with the big red button, so that if anything bad happens, you just smash that. It ain't gonna save you, but
With your bloody stump.
pretty much, it's not gonna save you. You get caught in this machine. It's gonna take more than a tourniquet.
What makes this super smoother?
So, what this machine essentially is if you take a hand plane and turn it upside down, and then feed it with a belt. So the part goes over it, it's pulled in by this belt. They just take a regular shaving, like a hand plane shaving, and it feeds however long of a part you're putting through it. So the nice thing about this is that if I have 10-foot long parts, they're very hard to plane on a bench, right? If you put it on a bench, that bench has to be perfectly flat. It also has to be 10 foot long. And so this gets additionally difficult as you get to longer and longer parts, which when I do architectural work, you might be dealing with 10 foot, 12 foot, 14 foot parts. And so because of the fact that it just simply pulls it into it, the length of the part doesn't matter anymore. So you can feed any kind of part through there. The other part of it is that you can feed a very wide part over it. So if I'm hand planing, if any of you aren't familiar with what's called, I believe it's called ukana, where it's a really wide one. And my Japanese pronunciation is going to be horrible, so I'm going to make no apologies for that. Just, it's as bad as it gets, so bear with me. That hand plane is going to be good for, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 passes before you're working on it again. This machine, you can put, 1,000 linear feet of material over it before you have to replace that blade. So it's making life a lot easier. But of course, there's some steps, some process to getting something like that.
You have the thickness plane, like prepare the stock ahead?
Yes.
That's your last step? Or?
Yeah, that's the first step. So getting the stuff from rough sawn to something rectangular that's perfect is sort of absolutely critical to this. And cutting the parts to exact length. So I did do quite a bit of suffering to make sure that what I'm cutting is accurate. So if you guys are used to like a normal chop saw, normal chop saws generally don't cut anything square ever. Maybe by happenstance they'll cut something square. So I went ahead and bought an Omga, which is a really heavy cast iron chop saw, used mainly for metalworking, but also for woodworking. And that thing is absolutely perfect. It cuts something perfectly square every time. So I've had it set up in my shop for years, and every time you take a cut with that thing, it's perfectly square, which is worth its weight in gold. Because when you go on to additional processes, like you're going on to tenoning, if you don't have a square cut at the end of your tenon, you don't have a square tenon, especially if you're using machine surfaces. If you don't have perfectly the same length parts, when you assemble this frame, it will not be square. Okay, so all these things seem very minor, yet as you go into making these, a lot of these quickly and have a good result at the end of it, having those small details right on is important. So this is what it looks like after you've planed enough of this for 40 Shoji screens, you make yourself a couple piles of shavings there. Those are shavings that are, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 inches wide. So, yeah, for everybody that's been out there planing, yeah, you look at that with different eyes. So the next step in this process, after I made all these parts, was simply assembling these. So this is for one job I had in Delaware, which they had ordered 40 Shoji screens, and I'm going through the process of assembling these. So now I've assembled the kumiko. There's only a handful of them here, but assemble all the kumiko first, and I add the rails on first, or after assembling the kumiko, and then move on to assembling the screens. So this is the parts, some of the parts look like, just in tons of kumiko. This is what I was stacked up in my shop at some point. So this is something I look at with pride.
Wow.
So, yeah, I felt fairly accomplished going from making everything by hand to making it with machines, producing good results, and having giant stacks of material at the end ready for assembly. This is all the frames as they're getting assembled. I don't have a big press, so one of the things I plan to add at some point in my shop is a big hydraulic press for assembling doors. So I'm stuck with just a million Bessey clamps. You can see at this part, this is the tenons on the kumiko as they go into the stiles. This is a detail I put on my shoji, which is, I don't believe that this is traditional, but I do it anyways. Just I find it looks nice to have the chamfer on the bottom edge there. I'm talking about this specifically. And this was one of the finished results. This was a beach house in Delaware, so.
Are you the installer?
Yes, yeah, which that brings me to this. That's why I brought this out, because I've gone through various stages in having tools for the job site. Initially, it was like, all right, I'm gonna show up with a handsaw and an impact gun, and hopefully nothing goes wrong. And I've moved on to having either some sort of version of every single tool I use in the shop, or something that, as I've gone through different installations, you realize that, hey, when you're 3 hours away and you really, really need a marking gauge, bring one. And so it seems very obvious at this stage, but when you're trying to put together your toolboxes, you have to kind of, I guess, hone down the stuff you really need versus the stuff that you think you may need. And I've developed, I guess, this toolbox from that, and I've got a couple other toolboxes in the car that are just stacked up of these Festool things, and this is what I find useful. So for the tracks, I have this plane. This is this Western plane. This is a 3/4 inch wide, so it's exactly the same as the grooves that Shoji ride in. So they ride in grooves. They ride on wooden tracks. I've got marking gauge. You never know. Then marking knife, chisels, this little square, which this thing is one of those ones that, yeah, it's awesome. And then flush cut saw, cross cut saw, rip cut saw, the tiny level, and then this is a chamfer plane, and little kind of, so. This is the one I actually use on job sites all the time. I almost never use a full-size plane. I know that probably deviates quite a bit from people who do mostly timber frame working, but doing kind of specializing in shoji, I end up using these little planes a lot. In my opinion, where Japanese planes shine the most is these, because I pretty much have 0 Western block planes in my shop because these things are amazing. So I tend not to worry about whether or not Western planes are better than Japanese planes. I don't care about any of that stuff. I'll use all of them. And so, but I found that I have no Western block planes because these do the job really well. They have a chip breaker or sub blade like Jim mentions, and this is a fantastic thing to have when you're dealing with stuff that's anything other than perfectly smooth and perfectly clear material. So Move on to the next here. I've got, this is a tea house that my friend Alan and I worked on. We built this in Princeton, near me, so. I did the shoji work, so my friend Alan and I, we kind of break up different different parts of our work. He tends to do the tokonoma, and I tend to do shoji, and we go back and forth on this kind of stuff. But this was a fairly large project that we built the tea room for, and then we did the exterior. And then this was one that actually Matt Connerton recommended me and Alan for. And this was a little small timber frame house in North Jersey, and it's fairly traditional, with exception to how it attaches to the foundation.
It's outdoors?
Outdoors, yep. The railings and the deck there are mahogany, real mahogany, as opposed to sapele.
How do you
So-
protect the paper in that?
That's paper
Resin.
between two sheets of plastic. So this is a Japanese product that they make. It's fantastic because you can't poke a hole in it, which is nice. And the only downside to it, of course, is that you have to tape it to the kumiko as opposed to gluing it, which I really rather glue it. But for outdoors, you can only ask for so much. And so you tape it to the screen. The paper is between two layers of plastic, so of course you have the edge all the way around. So for it to be truly waterproof, you have to caulk it, which you get mixed reviews on whether or not somebody wants it to be caulked, but that's just how it works. So there's another product that they produce that's kind of like a plastic plate, and this to me is a much better product because you're still making a standard shoji screen. I've used the plastic plates on a different project, and I don't really like them too much.
Plexiglass?
It's not really plexiglass, but pretty close. And so the downside to having a big sheet of plastic is that when it heats up, it grows. So this was something I learned on the job. And I had set up two shoji for the front of a tea house, and these plastic sheets would expand and bow inward, and so they would just pop off every so many weeks. And I came back and had to reattach them. And at some point, you're like, why does this keep happening? And so I talked to the seller of it, and she was like, oh, they grow and shrink with heat. I'm like, oh, great.
So is that product, it's like they're sealed, like those three layers are like
Yes.
sealed?
Yep.
Okay.
And it's almost indistinguishable from regular shoji paper. So this is regular shoji paper.
Uh-huh.
If you put the two side by side, you can't tell.
And what do you cut it with?
I cut it with a knife. So the big downside to these sheets is that they you can't cut them on a paper cutting machine. So because the paper cutting machine pulls a vacuum on the paper, and they cut it with I guess a big knife. Shoji paper is fairly porous, and so it won't stick to those machines. So you gotta cut it by hand. So.
Is there a question? Did you have a question?
I was just gonna say about the expanding and contracting, if you did that same detail that you have kind of between where you put the shoji paper in between, if you just made like a little spot for it to go into, almost like frame and panel, would that?
That's pretty much what you have to do.
Okay, so that they don't pop out.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
a little recess.
Okay.
So then they're just floating in that case then?
Yeah. So the big downside to that is that shoji, the paper is connected to the kumiko, and it adds some level of integrity to it. And so if you use those plastic sheets, you have to make the shoji a lot heavier to account for the fact that it's no longer utilizing that plate as structure. It's just a floating panel. So, you guys have questions?
Could you talk about the glue up process?
Yes.
I replaced some shoji paper once. It was a nightmare. You must have a special applicator so you can work quickly, but I found it difficult to do.
I generally just use a stick. So, if I have all my mortises laid out so I'll lay out all my styles, and I take just a little I guess like a thin stick, put it into I lay out some glue, and I generally just use Type On 1. And I dip it, put it into the mortise. You let it sort of set a little bit, and then I go ahead and do it again, because I'm not going to put it on the tenons. And the reason why is that if you put it on the tenons and you assemble the screen, the glue pushes out. And so then you have to go in and clean up all around all those tenons, which if you have a plain finish on all of them, it looks like hell. So not having that squeeze out is sort of critical. Same with these, where I have, like this is oil finished, and so I generally don't want to have squeeze out on this either. And so I just put it just into the mortises, and I've so far never had one come apart. Not one joint, so you know it works pretty well. Just you have to make sure that you coat that twice, so you're getting a pretty good amount of, you know, you're not letting it just soak into the end grain.
Just a question about I'm going to assume your thickness in all these pieces is critical.
Yes.
And so, what is the process of by the time you finish planing between that and the super surfacer, and do you know how many times?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. That's something I skipped over. So, one of the things that's important for this process is that when those kumiko go together, they have to go together tightly because they're not glued. They're just press fit together, right? So, the width of my cut is determined by that dado stack. And so after I cut that dado, I make them so that they slip together with the super surfacer. I generally just count shavings. So if I'm shooting for 1/4 inch cuts, I'll make the part, 0.26, and then I'll put it through the super surfacer, say 5 times or something like that, and then it slips together perfectly. If you miss that, like if you're not getting that to slip together exactly, what happens is that the screen forms a big curve to it as you're pressing those parts together, especially if it's tightly like this. Like this is a fairly tight weave, and so if they're all going together and they're a little too tight, what happens is it just forms this big bow. Now sometimes a little minor bow is helpful because as you press it flat, it locks all those together. But there's an area where if you go a little too tight and you press on it, you just snap all the parts, and so it's a delicate.
So it takes off how many times? What does it take off the super surfacer?
Well, it all depends on how you set it. So
Right.
I set it to be a little bit thicker than a hand plane, and so if a hand plane's taking off a thousandth of an inch, I might be taking off 2/1000. There's a limitation to how much you can take off and have a clean cut.
And you've mentioned finishing a couple of times. What type of finish do you use, and where is it applied within the sequence of putting the whole thing together?
That's an excellent question. So the nice thing about Shoji is that a lot of times I'm using Alaskan yellow cedar, and Alaskan yellow cedar, the surface planing is the finish. So I don't have to go back and put an applied finish. However, if I am using walnut, so for instance, this is for a cabinet, before I assemble the screens, I finish everything. And typically, like this one, I just use Rubio monocoat, which I'm pretty happy with. So
does that make any problem with when you're gluing them together? If the Rubio gets down into the mortise, I know with my work, if you get finish like on the parts you're gluing together, it doesn't glue together as well.
Yep.
I use that to my advantage sometimes for glue squeeze out.
Yeah.
I'll finish it first so I can just chop the glue off really easy. But for this, do you have any fear of that? If you get any finish in there when you're
just do a good job of it. That's pretty much what it comes down to. Is just be really careful about not getting it in there. One of the things I've done, and I go back and forth on this, is that sometimes I'll pre-finish all the kumiko even before I cut the joinery. Now the kumiko is not getting glued, but sometimes it just helps to make it so that if you're finishing it with a rag, you're not catching that rag on every one of these cuts. I guess I'm careful about doing this. So if you take a look at this when you get a chance, there's essentially no finish on the inside of this joint. If you wanted to, you could finish this before you even start cutting it. So you just have to be careful about your table surfaces. Like if your table saw's got a rough surface or something like that, it'll damage the finish. So if you're going to do something like that, you just do it before you cut your joints. The reason why I don't do it that way is that I cut all these shapes after I cut the main joinery, and so that's why I wound up landing on that process. So one thing I don't think I touched on too much was when I cut kumiko, the way I cut it is to make individual parts and then cut the joinery as one big stack. People do this differently. I've seen where they'll just use like a really wide sheet of material and then cut all the joinery first, and then they'll turn it into strips afterwards. I tend not to want to do that because I find that as I'm planing these down to a uniform thickness, I leave them a little bit long on the ends so that if there's any planer snipe, it happens at the end of it, and I don't have to worry about having that planer snipe show up in my finished work. So, you guys have more questions?
What do you use to glue the paper on the back?
Oh, that's a good question. Rice glue.
Traditional rice?
Yep, yeah. There's another type of shoji paper that I absolutely love, and it is one where it's 2 sheets of shoji paper glued, laminated onto a plastic sheet. This stuff's amazing. And so, because you can't poke a hole in it, which is really important when you're dealing with other trades, because they will poke a hole in your shoji screen. And then they come to you and say, hey, fix it. Like, awesome. So I had one in New York, so that's a 2-hour commute for me. And I had set up a cabinet, and we have the media guy poke a hole in my screen. All right? So I went up, fixed it, and he did it again.
Same place?
Same place, yep. So after that, I was like, you know what? I love this stuff, but I think what I'm going to do is move on to the type of shoji paper that doesn't get damaged by somebody poking a hole in it. So, live and learn.
How about when you're installing the tracks on site? How do you deal with, the irregularities and the work that's been done on site?
That's a good question, because what I've noticed about most projects that I've been a part of is that a normal person's expectations of flat is not flat. So the bottom track on these shoji have to be perfectly flat, or they have to be perfectly uniform, because as you slide them, if they have deviations, the screen does this, right? And so that has 2 negative effects. One of them is that the screen is going to kind of move weird as it goes across the track. The other thing is that as those screens are positioned at different spots in that track, if that track isn't perfectly flat, that screen is going to look like this. And so when your styles are overlapping, they're going to go like this, right? So they're going to come to you and say, well, you didn't make these screens square. And that, in that case, is not accurate. It's the track. So for me, it's all, I've increased the amount of effort I put into putting these tracks on the floor extremely flat. So the job in Delaware, that was one where I laid out self-leveling compound before putting the tracks down. And it worked to some degree. I think what I'll do in the future is make the bottom track extremely thick, make it weatherproof, cut the subfloor out, and go right down to the I guess the joists, the floor joists. Because on this, let's see, I'm gonna go through this one. This one right here, that lower track is actually 2 inches thick. And it made life way easier because that is perfectly flat. So as those shoji travel over it, smooth as can be. The other thing about those tracks is that the aesthetic of this room is yellow cedar. Yellow cedar does not wear particularly well on its flat grain, and so the tracks, I cut them out and put cherry laminations into the track so that it's riding on that. It does wear pretty much fine on the end grain. And so just as you move into your shoji making, one thing to notice is that this appears flat. It's not. It's a curve. So what this is actually contacting is this point to that point. If it contacts the whole length of this, inevitably it's going to rock as it goes. So sometimes I'll wait until afterwards to plane that, just put a curve into it, and sometimes I'll just make a step so that it's it's a little bit, the styles are kind of sticking out below it a little bit. So just minor things like that make your life a lot easier. You guys have more questions?
Where do you get the paper from?
I buy it from a seller in Wisconsin, Shoji. Yeah. I forget what her name is offhand, but she's wonderful. She's got me all kinds of different stuff. She's ordered me stuff from Japan. So the manufacturer of it, I can get that for you, but if you buy it in bulk from Japan, it's really expensive because you have to pay for FedEx shipping. So I've done that occasionally, and it's I'd rather just buy it from her because she buys big enough bulk that you don't have to deal with the shipping prices from Japan for FedEx. I bought a couple of those plates, and I think the shipping was like $700 from Japan. So that's also a deterrent.
Just one more question about the paper that is the 2 layers of paper with plastic in the middle.
Yep.
That's just glued on with rice glue.
Yes.
As well?
Yeah. That's the direction I was going with that. The nice thing about that, you just attach it like normal shoji paper. It lays perfectly flat. So one of the tricks to making it so that this is nice and tight is that you apply it, you wait for the glue to dry, and then you spray it with water, and it shrinks the paper and it makes it nice and taut like a drum. For that particular paper, you don't have to do that. So in fact, if you wet it with something, you're probably gonna ruin it. So it stays nice and tight.
And do you have those same expansion issues with that?
No, I haven't had any expansion issues with that. I guess it has enough slack in that whole assembly that it's been fine. I generally don't butt it all the way up tight to these sides. So for this kind of paper I do, but for that I'll leave a little bit, like a 1/16 of an inch, so that if it does decide to grow, then...
Is there a curve behind there? Are you tucking it underneath?
No, this is just lays flat on this.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is fairly traditional. So I added this effect to it where it has those grooves, essentially, so it has a landing place for it. I'm gonna take a look. Okay.
Are you making your own rice glue?
No, I don't. I don't think it's a big deal to do so, but I'd rather just buy it. So for that one job, I went through so much rice glue that I'm glad I didn't take the time to make it. You have more questions?
Yeah, a question about the grid spacing. So I imagine like Western doors are going to, the whole room will be a different kind of set of dimensions than a Japanese version of it. Are there kind of rules of thumb you use about?
Yeah, there's sort of some traditional style layouts. You're talking about that, or are you talking about specific spacing?
Or maybe what you follow to get what the kind of spacing you look for the projects that you're going to do.
So a traditional shoji screen is about 3 foot wide, and I'll work from there. So for the most part, I divide that into 3, and then I change the height to suit whatever elevation they're looking for. So I have a couple different samples of either upright spacing, which is very tight, or vertical or horizontal bias, and I'll send it over to my client, and they can choose. So when it comes down to certain very specific things, I usually let the customer choose it. So for this, a lot of my clientele are people who do tea ceremony, and so they're extremely particular about what they want, and so they'll say, like, I'm looking for this kind of thing. So it's nice because if you get somebody like that as you're learning this sort of thing, they act as a guide. Because, I had one client for a tea room that Alan and I built, and she was extremely particular about everything, but very, very nice to explain, like, I want it like this. And so that it made it so that, okay, I don't have to dig down into what these very specific things are for tea ceremony. She did all that work for us. So it is nice to run into clients that are understanding of the fact that, as you're doing this stuff, you're also learning. So.
With the plastic laminate
Mhm.
on the outside, does it create like glare or aesthetic
Nope.
issues? No.
It's perfectly matte.
Oh.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell the difference between that without touching it. If you go up and touch it, you'll know immediately. But if you don't touch it, you'll never notice. Yeah.
the little pieces or are they lap joints?
Oh, all right. So those are
mortised,
notched.
right? These are mortised. These are each
Yeah.
mortised into
So let's detail this. You're an eraser.
These are mortised with frame, but these are all lap joints.
Yeah.
So that part. Looks like this.
Yeah. Okay. So that's why they don't have to be fastened to each other.
Yes.
Because they're all
So-
mortised into this frame.
Yeah, exactly. They're mortised into the frame, and they kind of interlock in a sense.
Yeah.
You can weave those together, so you can have it so that these are alternating. And I think that's the way Jim does it. So when you talk to Jim Blavelt, he does it that way. It's a little bit more complicated. So I'm comfortable with this because I have a step built into those kumiko, so they're not the same thickness, and so that's one of the reasons why I don't weave them. So I chamfer around the top edge of those, and so I put all the joinery on one side.
The verticals are also mortised?
Yes. Yeah. So
Can you talk about pricing?
no.
Or your process of pricing?
Yeah, okay, I'll talk about my process of pricing. Basically, what pricing comes down to is how much you want to make for your time. So if you feel like your time is worth a certain amount per hour, then you go ahead and try and sell your services for that amount. You're competing against a market rate. Now, this doesn't have an obvious market rate, but it does have a market rate, because if you have a client who's searching for this sort of thing, they're going to go to a couple different people, usually, especially if you have some competition in your area, and they're going to find out what something costs. So, it's a complicated thing to say that something is worth something. And so when you go through this process, they may have various factors that they're thinking about. Like the job in Delaware, he was thinking about, hey, you know what, I want this to be super traditional. So somebody had presented, they were going to make it out of maple. And when they spoke to me, I said, I'm not going to use maple, I'm going to use yellow cedar. It's closer to the traditional wood. It's going to get you a lot closer to, the real thing than maple will. And so that was one of the factors. So I think the person making it in maple just makes doors, and so he could do it, but they weren't specializing in Shoji where I kind of do. So that may have outweighed the pricing, but I don't really know what they were charging versus what I was charging, and so they never made that clear to me if I was at the high range, medium range, low range. I don't know.
But
So
you got the job.
I did, yeah. So it worked for me. So that a lot of it is sort of an inward looking thing of, does this pricing work for me? And if so, if I feel like I'm making a living out of it, and the client's happy with the price, everybody's happy. So same goes for furniture.
I noticed on that panel you glued the Shoji paper to the kumiko also.
Yes, yeah.
I know some people just do this perimeter.
Yeah, that's a good question. Or I tend to always glue it to the kumiko because I want it to be really taut, and that will be different from somebody who wants it to kind of float. In fact, when I had this project here, you see that white right there? That's a Fusuma panel. And so when I started making those, I hadn't made them before, so I asked Jim for his advice, and he recommended just doing a perimeter of glue so that the panel, for the most part, floats. And so, that's how Jim would prefer to do it, and it's definitely a good way to go. Anytime Jim gives you advice, take it. All right. He has a lot more experience than pretty much all of us, so take his advice. It's good. So the nice thing about being in this group is that everybody, for the most part, shares stuff. So if you ask me questions about things, with the exception to a couple things which I don't answer, we're going to be pretty much an open book. So if you have how do I do this effectively? I'm going to answer that question. Same with pretty much everybody who you deal with. It's a good crowd. They're always helpful. So you ask almost anyone what they.
Were you pretty much self-taught then, or did you
train under somebody?
I didn't train under anybody, so I'm self-taught, but that comes with an asterisk of, yeah, I've taught myself how to do this kind of, because you're not in a vacuum. And so at every step, you're going to ask somebody's advice. So I was just lucky enough to always have people who were helpful. For instance, when I bought that German machine, there's a fellow named Mark Henneberry, and Mark has restored countless numbers of those, Maka SM6s, and so he had a complete breakdown of that machine. He had a parts list. He sent it all to me, just to be helpful. So that was kind of amazing. And so it's a type of thing you tend to move on to. You'll send it on to the next person. So the next guy says, "Hey, I want to restore one of these machines too. Can you help me out?" And here's the parts list. Here's all the stuff to be helpful. So Mark's helped me out countlessly. Jim's helped me out tons. I'm just lucky enough that I found the right group of people, and they're always willing. Early on in this process, one of my good friends, he passed away a couple of years ago, Chris Hall, and Chris and I always bounced around a lot of different, what's the best way to do a certain thing? How do you do this and remain fairly cost effective for a small shop, and that kind of thing. So, Chris had a lot of ideas on how to do things effectively, and his work was similar in that he went from making things mostly by hand to, I'd say for the most part, mostly by machine and hand tool effects afterwards. So something like the chamfer plane is going to be something you still use, but yeah.
So on that note, just out of curiosity, is there anything that you miss about doing it mostly or all by hand?
No. The nice thing about this is that when I work with hand tools, I very much enjoy it. And I'd say when I was using it 100% by hand, it's a good thing to do. So it's something that's sort of a I'll get to you in 1 second.
Yeah.
It's sort of a forged in fire sort of thing, where you go through it and you learn something that is intangible. It's something that if you haven't done it, you can't know it. So, like for instance, when Jim talks about using winding sticks, that's something that becomes very intuitive when you're working with nothing but by hand. So when you flatten boards by hand, make things to a certain size by hand, you have this sort of intuition about how something is made that I don't feel is quite available to you if you do it with nothing but machines, or if you do it with the majority of machines. So I found it useful, but I also yeah.
So when you were doing it all by hand, was the process the same? Was the joinery the same? Was all that, or have you changed? Has that changed a lot of things?
I've changed quite a bit of things. So again, my qualifier was that I want it to be better than a product which improves upon what I was starting with originally. So when I first cut these, the joinery I used was a double tenon, and once you cut enough double tenons, you start to realize the reason for a double tenon is not for strength. It's for the ability to hold together with glue that is fairly weak. So in Japan, in any time prior to now, or any time prior to modern age, the glue that they're using in any of these joints is going to be fairly weak glue. And so if you have double tenons, they stick together a lot better than a single tenon because you have twice as much surface area. The downside to that, of course, is that the double tenon is actually physically weaker than a single tenon. So for a Shoji screen, it doesn't matter, because you're not going to, if you stress a Shoji screen to the point where you're breaking the joints, you've done something else wrong.
Is it less secure because it's so skinny? Each tenon is so narrow?
There's two narrow tenons end up being weaker. So just as a curious thing, because I kind of assumed that this is going to be stronger initially, and so I applied it to chair making also. And then at some point I said, you know what, let's test the theory and see what happens. So I had a part that I assembled and just broke it. Just like, let's put it in a vise and snap it and see what happens. And a double tenon simply ripped off at the root of the tenon. So it taught me at that point that, hey, double tenon's not there for strength, it's there to hold together. A lot of woodwork that's not structural is just trying to hold together. So a Shoji screen is not a structural element. floating tenons. I
Like a
mean,
domino.
yeah, I'm not gonna do that, but you can. Yeah. I mean, I don't tend to look down upon it so much. Not so much, but you can use them because it's a fairly effective way to make certain things. Like if you're gonna make chairs, floating tenons are a good way to go. They're gonna make life a lot easier.
I feel like at that scale though, for the Shoji, you know, it's so small that.
Yeah, it's worse for Shoji. You're better off just making tenons.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no shoulder.
You're talking about just using an inserted tenon on the compound angles on a chair instead of.
Yeah. So there's certain things that a floating tenon is just making life a lot easier. So I don't own a domino. I tend not to use them. I just don't want to go down that path. But they're super helpful for certain things. Like I have a machine that's similar to it. So if I'm doing modern doors that just have a sheeting of plywood on the outside of it, then the frame I make for that is just going to be dowels. Yeah, so I have a dowel machine that's it's the Maffel's competition to Festool. You know, I went down the Maffel route. Yeah, so.
So switching from doing things primarily by hand to doing things primarily by machine, do you think there's still value in developing as craftsmen and building a skill set by making sure you learn to be proficient with the hand tools so that you will be able to do that?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's something that you learn by doing it by hand that you cannot learn by doing it by machine. So you tend to really, really appreciate the value of a mortising machine if you cut a mortise by hand. The other thing is, when you cut it by hand, you analyze it to a high degree. So you want to know, hey, is this square? How is it to the face? Is it uniform along the length? And when you go to cut it with a machine, you may notice that, hey, this machine actually isn't doing what I think. That machine, acquiring machine precision is not an easy thing in woodworking because a lot of the sort of mid-tier woodworking machines, they don't really cater to machine precision. It's just not there. And so if you don't have that hand background, you might look at something produced by one of those machines and say, oh, it's good enough, it's perfect. But when it assembles, it doesn't assemble right. And so it's not until you really suffer through, I'm going to do this by hand, do it correctly by hand, that you realize, like, oh, these surfaces all have to contact a certain way. Like Jeff was talking about this morning, if you guys were here for that, he was talking about you're cutting out an area, undercutting certain things. That's stuff that you learn when you do it by hand. People who, this is my experience, people who do mostly machine work don't come to that right away. And so, as you would expect, oh, if I cut the surface flat, it's flat, I don't have to worry about it. Where when you cut it by hand, you know, hey, I actually do have to worry about this because I can't make two, like Jeff said, two sheets of glass come together. It's pretty hard to do that. And so you find cheats of like, hey, I'm going to undercut this joint a little bit. Now, I don't necessarily have to do that too often, especially on Shoji. I don't need to undercut anything. But I have it in the wheelhouse of, hey, if I go to cut big joinery for like a tea house project, I know that if I undercut certain areas of certain joints, they're going to assemble really tightly. So, yeah, there's a lot of value to learning it by hand.
How often do you take a chisel or a hand plane to the machined parts in the shop? Like before they actually go out?
It depends.
Okay.
It depends. So for Shoji specifically, I have a couple things which I do by hand, which are once that you can see the chamfers on top and bottom there. I do those basically by hand, and I cut the chamfers with this plane on the outside. So that's what I'm doing by hand with this. It's not much, but for other aspects of my work, like if I'm making tables and chairs and stuff like that, they vary from being minimally by hand to very much by hand. If you make a chair, it's a lot by hand. You know, like I have a chair that I make for that's mostly carved seat back, and there's a lot of hand tools involved with that. So.
Do you have any tips on sourcing bigger machinery? Thinking about possibly getting a super service.
Yes. There's a lot of value in having a wide time frame because all this stuff shows up eventually. It just doesn't show up when you want it to. So I bought that Maka, I don't know, I guess a bunch of years ago at this point. Now, that was the only one on the market at that time, and I was scouring for like, I really want this machine. So, when you have that outlook, it's like, okay, you only have these parameters, and so if some piece of junk shows up, you're like, oh, maybe. And so, in my case, it was worth it for me to go through it and then, remanufacture the machine essentially. However, if you have a broader timeline, then eventually something pops up where you're like, oh, this thing is in perfect condition. Because of course, the minute you buy a piece of junk and restore it, then something perfect shows up for a cheap price. Which I've had that happen. There was a couple of Makas that went up. One of them sold in Austin, Texas, and it was pristine. And I was like, well, I guess I learned a lot by remanufacturing it, but could have lived without that experience.
Could we then pay you to restore another one so we can get the perfect cheap ones? No pricing talk. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, you could theoretically, but you'd be much better off to just find one that's in good shape. If you look at Mark Henneberry's website, he sells those machines occasionally. He restores them and sells them, and what they go for is it's a pretty substantial amount of money. And so you do realize that if you're trying to build a shop rate for a piece of woodworking machinery, it doesn't take long before it's a pretty expensive piece of woodworking machinery.
Question. I think the hardest machine it seems to find that's decent is the hollow chisel mortiser.
Yes.
That's been my experience.
Yep.
The floor model or the
all of them.
Yeah. So hollow chisel
Not
mortisers
great.
in the U.S. are generally like either a gigantic thing,
Yeah.
or it's a little tiny piece of junk.
Yeah.
And so I stumbled upon a seller in Wisconsin that had that Wadkin machine. I was looking for it. He's like, you know what? I don't really cut many joints with this.
How do you find a one?
I wanted to buy it.
I've been looking.
Of all things.
Probably have to import a lot.
I've been looking.
But you're probably going to have to.
Most likely you'll have to import it, but they do show up. There was one that showed up recently in Canada. Somebody, one of my friends bought it, and there was another one showed up in North Carolina. So
The guy in Canada, Jack, is on YouTube or?
Jack has one, but he wasn't who was selling it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jack has every kind of exotic machine.
But he's imported a lot of those. Right?
Yeah. Yep. Well, keep in mind that Canada is, I suppose, is part of the UK, so they bring in that kind of machinery, and so they're going to bring in stuff that generally doesn't get imported to the U.S. So if it does happen to travel over the border, great, but it's not too often. So in the U.S. we tend to bring in German machinery. So German, for whatever reason, don't do a hollow chisel mortiser. So the Maka's great, but again, you can't cut a square with it, at least not one that's 1/4 inch, and so you're limited to what it can do.
What do you think of the multi-co hollow chisel mortisers?
If it's anything other than like a 900-pound piece of cast iron, I wouldn't bother. Yeah, it's amazing how heavy that column has to be before it's actually strong enough to retain its integrity when it's cutting. Now, when it's cutting a 1/4 inch mortise, that's one thing. But in my shop, I use it for everything from 1/4 inch mortises for kumiko to like timber joinery. So what these guys are cutting with that, in my shop, I just cut it with a freestanding machine. So it's nice to have something that'll actually cut like a 1 inch wide mortise without deflecting. It doesn't take much before that happens, especially in harder material. So if you're go ahead.
Where you said that you ground down the
auger.
Auger, thank you.
Yep.
You ground that. Isn't that even more pressure? It's harder to go through then, right?
Yes. So if you do have the auger slightly larger than the chisel itself, it has that positive effect of making it easier work on the chisel. So I haven't noticed it too much. So because I make the chisels extremely sharp, and there's a process for that too, because it's not always intuitive. Sharpening those chisels is quite a bit of work to do it effectively. So I found a way to basically mock it up in my lathe. I don't turn it on, but I just use it as a fixture. And then I use a chuck in the tailstock. I put a big diamond cone that I found, and I cut it with that and polish it with that, and then I put diamond paste on that to make it really nice. And then the outside of those chisels is polished with like a 10,000 grit stone, so they're nice and slick.
So that way you're not decreasing the size of the chisel, you're just polishing it, you're sharpening it from the inside.
Yeah, sharpening it from the inside. I guess in some ways you are kind of shrinking it, but a little bit. You know, I'm just
'cause,
taking off the
like,
burr.
When most people I've seen sharpen a hollow chisel mortiser do the outside, and then you have the issue that if you don't have a shoulder on it, eventually it gets smaller and smaller. And
Yeah,
smaller.
yep. I tend to also keep that auger super sharp.
Yeah.
So if you haven't gotten auger files, buy some auger files. They're good. You know, it's something that you use if you used a bit and brace. Of course, you notice when it's not sharp, so you go ahead and sharpen those with an auger file. Same thing works for the hollow chisel mortiser. People I've noticed tend to have an idea that like the cutters for a machine should be perfectly sharp from the factory. It's a nice idea. It's not reality. And so for this work, you have to make them extremely sharp, just like you would hand tools. You guys got more questions? Fire away. Appreciate it.